Why do we love JRPGs? We can all appreciate games with great music, art style, and graphics, but you certainly need more than just that to make a great JRPG. At the very least, you either need a well-written and engaging story with an interesting cast of characters, or fun and addictive gameplay. I think that most of us can agree that both are important, but when push comes to shove, we do lean one way or another. And this is a common debate among JRPG fans. There's tons of discussion talking about which is more important, and a lot of people consider themselves either a gameplay guy or a story guy. So today, I wanted to delve into this topic a little bit and give my personal opinion on this matter. Let me know what you guys think. Do you prefer gameplay or story in your RPGs? Let's start off by defining what exactly we mean by story and gameplay. When we think about story in RPGs, there's three major elements that we talk about: the main plot, the characters that drive this plot forward, and the setting, which is the world in which the game takes place and its atmosphere. When talking about gameplay, the primary aspect of it is the battle system, which can be turn-based, real-time action, strategy, or some sort of hybrid. But it also includes the customizability, such as the skill trees, the level up systems, and the equipment. These are your crafting mechanics, your sphere grids, and your materia systems. Gameplay also includes how you navigate through the world, and it includes stuff like movement speed, fast travel, and puzzles that you have to solve. Now, when I'm evaluating the gameplay or story in a game, I look at what the game is trying to do and whether it succeeds at doing it. The reason for this is because I believe that a game shouldn't be criticized for something that it's not going for. For example, the Super Mario Bros. Series has virtually no story, and we don't criticize this aspect of the game. We evaluate it based on its gameplay mechanics because that is the main draw of the game, and it does damn well in that area. On the other end of the spectrum, we don't evaluate the gameplay in Steins Gate because it's a visual novel. We evaluate the story, which is incredible. These are obviously two extreme examples, but the idea applies to JRPGs as well. It's important to think about whether the game is more story-driven or gameplay-driven and factor that in accordingly. When looking at story, I like to think about it in terms of these four quadrants. Keep in mind that this chart is a spectrum, and that the placement of every game in this chart is my personal opinion. Your chart might look very different. The top right corner are games that are story-driven and have really good stories. When I say that a game is story-driven, I'm really talking about stuff like how much dialogue there is, how much time it takes to build its world, the amount of cutscenes, and how much restriction is placed on gameplay for story reasons. So some of the games that I would include in this category are stuff like Persona or The Legend of Heroes. These are games that have a lot of dialogue, but they're very engaging. You might have to read a lot when you're playing these games, but you'll be interested in the dialogue on the screen, and it will pay off in the long run. Now the top left corner is a little bit of a trickier one. These are games that have good stories, but aren't necessarily story-driven. What I mean by this is that there isn't necessarily a lot of dialogue or emphasis on plot, but when there is a story segment, it's interesting. Think of it as a game that uses its dialogue efficiently. Now obviously the highs of this category don't quite reach the highs of the previous category. However, I can really appreciate that these games are really efficient in telling their stories and don't really place restrictions on the gameplay. Some of the games that I consider to be a part of this category are the Rune Factory games, which has a town full of characters that are really wholesome and fun to interact with, but for the most part, the story doesn't obstruct your gameplay or your day-to-day activities. There's also the Grandia series, which is certainly gameplay driven, but manages to keep me engaged when the story segments do come up. Next is the bottom left corner. These are games that have bad stories, but they aren't necessarily story driven. Honestly, I don't think this category is a problem as long as the gameplay is good. I actually consider one of my favorite series of all time, Ys, to be a part of this category. The stories of this series are usually some variation of adult Kristen losing his memories and having to slay some monster, and honestly it's not that great. But that's okay because the gameplay kicks ass, and that's why I played the series. Another game I consider to be a part of this category is 7th Dragon III Code VFD. Honestly, at some point, I started getting tired of the story, and I just wanted to play the game. So I started skimming over the dialogue, or even skipping it entirely, and I was fine with that. And finally, we have the bottom right corner. Games that try to have a good story, but unfortunately they fail miserably. These are games that really have a lot of dialogue, and they're definitely trying, but they're just not that engaging. One of the games that I consider to be a part of this category is Bravely Default. I couldn't stand the absolute stupidity of the characters who were totally unaware of what was going on around them, and the exact same idiotic jokes were repeated throughout the entire thing. It was a frustrating experience, to say the least. The interesting thing about these quadrants is that the only one that's objectively good is the top right corner, and the only one that's objectively bad is the bottom right corner. The two on the left are subjective. If you don't care about story or you don't want much story, you can still find a lot of enjoyment in these games. But if you really want an in-depth and engaging story, neither of these categories are for you. And I think that's where the nuance lies. Take a look at these two statements. For the first statement, I obviously respect your right to say it and have that opinion, but I would strongly disagree with it. I think that for a series like Ys, criticism of its gameplay is much more valid. I don't believe that a weak story makes it bad. Statement number 2 makes a lot more sense to me, and I could certainly see where people are coming from when they say this. The same idea of the quadrants can also be applied to gameplay in JRPGs. The top right corner are games that are gameplay driven and they succeed in this area. This includes stuff like the Fire Emblem series, which is incredibly addictive and mentally stimulating. You really need to think about every single one of your moves and plan everything out, and it's so rewarding to see everything fall into place. I also consider games like Final Fantasy XII to be a part of this category. It introduced the fantastic Gambit system, which pretty much lets you plan out the AI's every move. The system was so well done that it's even influenced Western RPGs like Dragon Age Origins. The top left corner involves games that have great gameplay, but aren't necessarily gameplay driven. Again, this one can be tricky, but I consider something like Persona to be a part of this category as well. The gameplay in that series is certainly limited in comparison to the story, and it's also restricted by the story. You can't always go to a palace, but when you do go, the battle system is really good. Now for games with bad gameplay but aren't necessarily gameplay driven. I think Final Fantasy XIII is a good example of this. I was actually mildly interested in the story, but the gameplay between the cutscenes was frustrating to say the least. And finally, for games that are gameplay driven but don't necessarily have great gameplay, I would unfortunately have to put Xenoblade 2 here. The game bombards you with tutorials, and the enemies are just way too tanky. It just took way too long to get to the next story objective. Not to mention that it actually took away the mechanic of moving around while auto-attacking from the original game. I actually do like the story in Xenoblade 2, but after a while I couldn't deal with the gameplay. Now just like with the story chart, the one that's objectively good is the top right corner, and the only one that's objectively bad is the bottom right quadrant. The two on the left are subjective. So this leads back to our question. Which is more important, story or gameplay? As I just illustrated, it's highly dependent on what game you're playing. If you're playing a story-driven game, story should be factored more, and if you're playing a gameplay-driven game, gameplay should be factored more. But I'm not going to be a total cop-out, so I will give you guys my personal opinion. Looking at the genre as a whole, I would give a slight edge to gameplay over story. It really boils down to the fact that I can tolerate games with poor stories if the gameplay is great, but I can't tolerate games with bad gameplay, even if the story is fantastic. Even in story-driven games, the gameplay still takes up a significant amount of your overall playtime, and if I'm absolutely miserable for half the game, I'm not going to find enjoyment. It's going to be tedious to get from one scene to another. On the other hand, if the story is bad, there's ways around it. I can just skim through the dialogue or skip it entirely. I've actually done this with games like Disgaea and still found a lot of enjoyment. Also, I love the fact that my characters improve as I play the game. As a kid, I was obsessed with the idea of leveling up, and this is something that has really stuck with me over the years. I would spend hours upon hours just leveling up my characters, and it was a sort of positive feedback loop for me. I'd get rewarded for participation in combat, which caused me to participate in even more combat and earn more rewards. It was this sort of positive feedback that drew me in and really got me to enjoy battle systems in JRPGs. On top of all this, I actually hold the opinion that very few JRPGs truly have great stories. Don't get me wrong, I find most JRPG stories to be enjoyable and fun, but not necessarily well written or objectively good. For most games, you can find a lot of holes and inconsistencies once you start analyzing them and breaking them down. Most JRPGs manage to keep the stories interesting enough for me, but it's very rare for a JRPG story to really be great and absolutely blow me away. On average, I find gameplay to be more enjoyable than story. However, I will say that when the story is truly well written and engaging, it does supersede the gameplay. A lot of my favorite games of all time are story driven. A great story is usually the most memorable part of a game. Think about some of the classics of the genre, and most of the time we talk about the story. We talk about the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI, the end of Disc 1 in Final Fantasy VII, or the devastating reality that is 2300 AD in Chrono Trigger. It's these moments that really stick with us over time, not necessarily a specific battle in the game. So just to reiterate, I think that the story has potential for a higher peak than gameplay in JRPGs, but on average I find more enjoyment from gameplay than I do with story. Also, I'm a lot less tolerant of poor gameplay than I am of poor story. If I'm miserable while I'm trying to get to the next cutscene, I'm probably going to drop the game. So what do you guys think? I'm interested in hearing your opinions, so leave a comment below and let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.